Thanks, Adam. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of a long day, although the evening lies ahead. So we're going to try and keep things moving fairly briskly. We each are going to have 10 minutes to cover our topics. I'm going to set the stage both from the OSTP perspective, but also a broader global perspective, take it to the institutional level. Then Ralf is going to pick up the publisher and society angle, and then Curtis will talk about the library landscape in greater detail. We aim to leave about 10-15 minutes for Q&A. So that's us, and that's that. So open access, I think there's a general understanding in the landscape now of why open access is something we're spending so much time pursuing, why it brings benefit to researchers, to our institutions, to society at large. And I'm going to take that as given. The Budapest Open Access Initiative, I can't believe it is now 21 years old, and was really the first landscape marker that said open access is something that goes beyond any individual institution. We need to work collectively to advance open access. And what really strikes me even today, looking back at the declaration, was that open access to peer-reviewed journal literature was the goal. 20 plus years ago, there was a lot of criticism that open access was second-tier publishing. It was vanity press. It wasn't the elite peer-reviewed journals that are indexed in Web of Science and Scopus and so on. But I think we have made a lot of progress since then. Earlier today, somebody mentioned the Finch report, and I think that is a good marker of progress in that for the first time, I think, a national government publicly said, we want all of our research to be open access. We recognize that money has to change hands, and this is how we're going to make it happen. More recently, Plan S took a similar approach, advocating for open access journals and platforms, but really pursuing immediate open access, making everything fully available upon publication. So we've gone from, in this quick dash of global policymaking, from Budapest to the UK to Europe, and then August last year, just over a year ago, the OSTP issued its memorandum where it recommended that federal agencies do various things, and it recommended that research emerging from federally funded projects be made publicly accessible. And I know others have made this point today, but I do think it is critical to emphasize this. This is not a mandate, it's a recommendation, and it's not open access, it's public access. There are subtle differences, but these are critical ones. And I do think that there's still a lot of partly confusion about that. I've seen many colleagues jump up and down celebrating the fact that the OSTP has mandated open access. It hasn't. We're still waiting for many of the federal agencies subject to the memorandum to come back with their proposals on how they will give life to the document. But nevertheless, I don't want to be too critical. It brought to many institutions for the first time really a recognition that something is happening. So what is that something? It's important to understand what is driving the OSTP, thinking about the stakeholders in the system and how they might be impacted. And then I'll wrap up with just a few words about how my university has approached this. The pandemic has changed so much, but I remember being on a call with the OSTP in May 2020, so just a few weeks into the pandemic, where senior policymakers were acknowledging that a lot has changed already. We have seen researchers working across geographic borders and across industry, university, research organization, healthcare system boundaries, and we can't go back. That collaboration to identify cures and treatments, to seek vaccines, has shown that opening up science is a critical distinction. UNESCO had been investing a lot of time in its open science policy framework, but when its final declaration was released, it too acknowledged the formulative effect of the pandemic. So all of that is feeding into OSTP's thinking quite clearly. When I think about opening up science, I think about the products of research, publications, data, and code and software. And the OSTP has called out publications and data as things that fell within the scope of their policy framework. It's unfortunate, to my perspective, that they didn't include software and code, because so much of COVID research showed the interrelatedness between data and software, because researchers were writing code to analyze their data, and giving somebody the data without the underlying code is somewhat meaningless. But I think we will get there over time. It's important, though, when you think about opening up the products of research, that you understand the scientific research workflow. This is our open science workflow model from CMU, where we map out a suite of products and services that we offer to our research community. Because clearly, if we begin research with the end in mind and guide people towards open workflow solutions, then when it's time to share the products of research, much of the building blocks already are in place. Now, the OSTP memo of 2022 was not their first signal. There was the John Holdren memo of 2013, and a lot of good progress has been made since then. A limited number of agencies were subject to the provisions of that memo, but we can see that 8 million articles have been made freely accessible through the guidance from that memorandum, and it has started to shift the culture of collaboration in federal government, in institutions. But we're still on that journey. What we've seen is the federal funding agencies, and I'm using the NIH here as an example, building data archives and PubMed Central, which will be known to many, as ways in which they can help researchers discharge the Holdren memo expectations. I did some very crude number crunching, simply in dimensions, looking at the number of articles published acknowledging a US federal funding agency in recent years. And the dimensions data showed that about a third of the articles, however, are not open access. And if we think about that annualized at an average APC of $3,000, and I know that APCs are maybe yesterday's currency, but that's showing a funding gap of something in the region of $250 million a year if full open access is to be achieved, as opposed to public access. So just keep that figure in mind. When I think about the landscape, the key players that I am interacting with are publishers who are understandably concerned about the long-term impacts of open or public access on their business models. Many societies are deeply concerned about the potential loss of publishing revenue. They are not generally in a for-profit business, but they are covering their costs and often contributing to the costs of other important programs through their publishing activities. We need to understand the long-term impacts on them. From the university's perspective, generally people are keen to pursue ways in which the research from an institution can be widely and openly shared. And researchers, of course, are keen to understand the impacts of their work. They want to maximize awareness of their research. So against that backdrop, how might publishers respond? There's the question of the author manuscript. In a public access world, sharing the author's manuscript with or without an embargo period might work. Most publishers would prefer not to have a zero embargo period because that might begin to impact adversely on their business. Gold open access might be a sustainable revenue stream for publishers, but they might be concerned about the loss of rights. Whenever the author retains rights to the article, that constrains a publisher's long-term ability to resell access to that. Hybrid open access might give the best of both worlds, but there are continual questions about double dipping. Are you charging for an APC and charging for a subscription for the same content? What about the messy rights issues, where a journal might have some articles that are the rights are owned by the publisher and others have the rights owned by the author or an institution? And is there a tipping point at which point all of this becomes really messy? So we're still watching the landscape and trying to understand how that is going to play out in the long term. The one point I would make is that there is an excess of funds that publishers and societies either wish or need to protect. And I'm not casting aspersions here. They have either shareholders or owners or societies that are vested in the business model. But if you do, again, some simple, this truly is back of the envelope arithmetic, there are about 2 million articles published each year in a global subscription revenue base of 7.6 billion euros. That's about 3.8 thousand euros per article. That ultimately leads to a potential loss of, if the market settled at a 2,000 euro APC, that would be a 47% reduction of revenues. How does that play out in the marketplace, whether it's shareholder revenues or society revenues? We need to understand that also in terms of transitional costs. If we get to the end of the open access rainbow, where the costs of scholarly publishing have moved from readers to authors, the redistribution of costs will be heavily concentrated in research-intensive institutions. How do they find the money to cover those costs? Fascinating questions. I'm optimistic that we will get there. From the perspective of my institution, I'm going to go incredibly quickly through this. In preparation for an open or public access world, we've had a repository in place for many years. We have a journal publishing service. We provide an APC fund, and we've negotiated many transformative agreements. About 6 years ago, I looked at who were our biggest publishers, and we set out to secure transformative agreements with each of these. I will say that the top one on the list still evades us, but over the past few years, we have put in place agreements with most of our big publishers and other valued partners. And we're at a point now where something around 80% of our institutional output is covered by a transformative agreement. On the data side, the most important initiative at Carnegie Mellon just now is the recent opening of our cloud lab, where about 200 pieces of scientific apparatus are housed in a remote warehouse operated by robots and technicians. And this we see accelerating the volume of research, but also enhancing reproducibility given the quality of metadata coming from a closed laboratory system, and advancing open science. And on the software and code side, the Sloan Foundation has funded us to establish an open source programs office. That office has worked with the cloud. Oh, did you want to photograph that one? I'll go back for a moment. 3, 2, 1. So our open source programs office has collaborated with the creator of the Cloud Lab operating environment to make that fully open source. And we see that as a big step forward, both for our own purposes, but also for other institutions that might build upon the Cloud Lab model. We really wanted to open up the entire ecosystem. And we have been talking about this in Washington, D.C., really trying to elevate the appreciation of software and code as a critical product of research and a critical part of the research infrastructure. My colleague Syed Chowdhury, who many of you will know, and I had a piece in The Hill on this a few weeks ago. So a quick gallop through our institutional perspective. To hear from the Wiley side, I'm going to hand over to Ralf.
Yes, thank you very much, Keith. Yes, welcome everybody. I want to take up this thread and discuss the OSTP memo a little bit in the context of the development of the past 10 years. Let me see. I have to get into the flow here. So we have heard reference to the OSTP memo several times today, and there were also dedicated sessions. So each presented a different perspective. Mine is really a contextualizing perspective. So, and when we look at the memo, first of all, it's really in a very clear continuity with the Holdren memo of 10 years earlier, 9 years earlier to be precise. And with lifting the embargo to zero as probably the most pronounced aspect in the entire document. What I want to highlight here is a quote from page 2 on the left side, and with the underlined phrase that they think to promote equity and advance the work, now is the time to amend the federal policy. So the authors must have a strong sense that there's a good time for doing what they are doing. When we look at the reception side, the OSTP memo received a lot of praise, a warm welcome. Many people were surprised and didn't see it coming. And of course, there were also many high hopes attached to the memo, and in particular to what will result and from the reformulations and updates of the agency policies that are going to come. Here is a quote just from September this year by Robert Jan Smits, who was the key architect and initiator of Plan S. And he welcomed the OSTP memo as the icing on the open access cake. When we look at this, I think we can ask the question, well, which cake? And also about the timeliness, what time? And when we look at the time, we must state first and foremost that we are clearly not in 2013 anymore. Too many things have happened in the last decade. We have seen massive growth and also innovation in open access. For those of you who have been around in our industry, in the discourse about open access, open science 10 years ago, and compared to now, you will all see that things have changed very, very massively. And what I've listed here on this slide is just only a quick run through and not even exhaustive in what could be listed here. So we have seen an enormous uptake of open access of all flavors, now reaching levels of 50% and continuing to grow rapidly. New approaches and stakeholder alignments were developed and tested. Scope 3, transformative agreements, subscribe to open, community models, and diamond models as well. New political initiatives who turned out to be very influential have emerged in the past 10 years. OA 2020, Plan S, EU policy statements, the G7 statements, UNESCO, and many, many updates in national open access policies, many of which are much more comprehensive and also decisive and ambitious compared to the OSTP memo. And last but not least, there was also a very significant behavior change on the part of the publishers. There is clearly more responsiveness to new models and new thresholds for journal or entire portfolio flips. And I think the opening plenary this morning with high-level figures, gave further testimony to this. And also what has always important for me personally was also that open access is not about making content open. It also has to do with changes in infrastructure, workflows, operations, teams, and people involved have to perform new roles, develop their roles further, etc. So the infrastructures have also developed very significantly. ESAC, Kronos, OABLE, RightsLink for open access, and just this summer, the announcement of a NISO working group to develop best practice for operationalizing OA business processes are just examples and proof points of these developments. And so I would say when we do a painting of this year, of last year when the memo was published, or this year where we live now, and compare it to 10 years ago, this picture would look completely different. So I think it can be an interesting question to ask whether OSTP is making a good point or whether they are missing a point. From a publisher perspective, we could say that OSTP is certainly not spot on to where Wiley and other publishers are currently heading. So Wiley, like many, if not most publishers, has moved beyond the old dichotomies. And for those of you who have been around longer, you know that there were dichotomies. There was fierce debate. There was also manifest opposition to the principle of open access. But this has all gone away. Not that there is not controversy anymore, and there are also points that can be debated, but it's not as it used to be still 10 years ago. So Wiley is embracing open access, has made that publicly clear over and over again, and is also organizing action to prove that claim. Wiley has been launching new open access journals, has been transitioning previously subscription-based journals to open access journals and continues to do so. We are involved in the political sphere and political debate, and Wiley is growing transformative agreements as a key strategy. So in this graphic, you can see the current state of play for Wiley. As of now, Wiley has 79 transformational agreements covering 2,700 institutions and 70,000 plus articles in this context. And when you look at the next slide, how this has all developed, you can see that there is massive growth. So in just only these 4 years that you can see here. In 2019, Wiley started out with 16% open access. I hope the numbers are you can read the numbers, and it's pretty much on average a 10% increase over the years in open access. In 2022, Wiley had 46.1% of all the published articles open access, and this is continuing to grow. So Wiley is proud of this development and also prepared and invests in concepts, technology, people, everything, infrastructures, and is not afraid of a future that is more open access and ultimately perhaps 100%. So we are on a way to cross the divide, and Wiley is proud to be part of that journey. In concluding my short presentation here, I want to pose a somewhat unexpected, surprising question and ask you what Neil Armstrong may have to do with open access. The idea for that statement here came from a Coalition S webinar that I attended last week. And there it was said that publishing is not rocket science and can be changed very quickly. When I heard that, I immediately thought, well, I have to think about that, and I would not be so sure. Then I looked up the dates, and I looked it up that the Sputnik crisis happened in 1957. And from that moment, it took only 12 years to get the first man on the moon. 12 years. Compare that to our open access debate. We have been debating already for more than 20 years. And we still cannot see when we will get our first man on the moon. So therefore, open access might look simple, but in the end, maybe it's more rocket science than many people think. So I was thinking about, of course, the first man on the moon. Then I thought, what would Neil Armstrong probably have to say about open access? And then I thought, and to comment this OSTP memo, and of course this is a lot of irony here, he may have said, that's one small step for humankind, one giant leap for a country. So sometimes our steps may appear as big, but from a perspective, they might not be like this. And with that, I would like to thank you and pass on to Curtis Brundy.
Well, thank you to Ralf, and thanks for the chance, for the invitation to be here on the panel. So I think that I'm going to move this out of my face a little bit here. I talk kind of loud. I think that Keith and Ralf set a lot of the context for the memo, and what I'd like to do with my time is I think that we're already seeing like concrete responses from publishers on what they're doing with this new guidance, and I think it's really interesting. So just a little bit of background, I'm from Iowa State. We were, in the US, I think we were out on the leading edge with moving toward these types of open access agreements. We're probably at 25% of our corresponding authored output is being covered by our agreements at this point. I would say for the last few years, we've shifted our focus somewhat, and we have really tried to be a vocal and proactive voice in trying to advocate for sustainable and equitable approaches to open access. And I think this year has been a big year for equitable approaches to open access. So things we've been involved with, OASPA led a really, really interesting global equity workshop series that had voices from across the globe talking about equity, talking about what we're doing well, what we need to do better. Surfaced a lot of perspectives, I feel like, that do not get enough attention in the community. And then I was able to work with Colleen Campbell in OA 2020 to organize a workshop of the Americas around equity and working with partners like Copies in Brazil and UNESCO. And that was another really, really interesting conversation. And from my perspective, an opportunity to work with colleagues like from the Global South who are really my neighbors, and I have no excuse not to already have those relationships, and it was just a really rewarding experience. And so to me, when I think about this memo, the piece of it that just jumped out at me really was like the centering of equity. And if you read this memo, you know, equity is mentioned all over. Equitable outcomes, equitable access, equitable reach, equitable delivery. And this came out at a really good time for us at Iowa State because we had just basically tossed out our traditional collection policy and rewrote a brand new one that centers our land grant values and centers values like equity. So we immediately felt like a lot of agreement and alignment with this new memo. And I think another interesting piece that has already been mentioned just is this public access piece of it. Like, it is not about open access, it's about public access. And what jumped out at me is, well, this is wide open to interpretation, so I think we're going to see some really interesting ways that this is actually going to be implemented by publishers, and we have seen that, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them in just a minute. And then I just wanted to say that the data piece of it is just huge, and we spend so much time talking about the publication side of it, but I will say, like, the colleagues that were reaching out to me at Iowa State, like one of our ADs for research, like, their concerns, it's on the data side. Like, they understand, like, the researchers get how important and what a big lift it is going to be to share this data. So we've got a new collaboration going with one of our colleges where we're going to house a position that they're funding that's going to join our data team. And that was like a direct outcome, like that partnership was a direct outcome of this memo. So what I'm going to do with the rest of my time, I'm going to talk about 3 U.S. scholarly societies and how they have taken different approaches to meeting this new recommendation, this new guidance. And then I'm going to mention, I'm not going to rank these, well, I'm kind of ranking them, but I'm going to tell you what I think about them and how they fit with how we're thinking about these things at Iowa State. So the first one here, the American Society for Microbiology. I don't know if anybody from ASM is here. Melissa was at our pre-conference for, well, there's somebody in the back. Well, I know that the conversation at ASM, because it served on some of their advisory groups, like they were talking about open access and how they're going to transition before the memo came out. But to me, what was interesting about, so now ASM is going to adopt subscribe to open. They're going to use that to transition all their journals that are not their gold ones. But to me, I think what the memo did for ASM is it provided a timeline, it provided a validation of their strategy. And I think that happened for a lot of publishers that were finding their way to an open access transition. This memo came out and they were like, okay, it's go time. Here's our timeline. And to us, this has been a really positive turn of events. I mean, we need to put deadlines on these things or else they're never going to happen. And I think for ASM, I think they would have moved. I think, again, it validated their strategy, helped them get a timeline. And I'll just say, they adopted subscribe to open. I talk about subscribe to open all the time, but I think it is our most equitable model. It's our simplest model. So in ranking ASM's response, they get an A+. I didn't put A+s in grades on my thing, but now I'm giving grades here. The next one I'm going to talk about is the folks at AAAS in science. And their approach to meeting the new requirement is what they're calling the green OA0 day. So if an author is, under these new requirements, that author can deposit the author accepted manuscript immediately and meet this new requirement. So to me, this is a more narrow, response. One of our goals at Iowa State is to fully transition our subscription spend to paying for open access. And we are still paying for a paywalled subscription to the science journals, so they're not going to get an A+. But I think in AAAS's credit, they came out early and vocally in support of the memo, and I feel like the folks there get it, and they're trying to navigate this landscape where the surplus that they generate off of this publishing operation funds all of the good work that they do. And I get that. So we need to figure out how to sustain the type of good work that these scholarly societies do. But we also need to figure out how to get them from charging us for these paywalled subscriptions and get them motivated to move fully to open access. And I've told Bill Moran that at Science. So we're a little less enthusiastic about this, but I feel like this isn't an end state for AAAS in science. I think they want to find a full way to move to open access, so good job. And last, I want to talk about our friends at ACS and another society that does good work, another society that generates one of those healthy surpluses to do all of these things that I think we all care about and we see that advance science. So it's not to criticize them, but I specifically wanted to mention this article development charge that they came up with. So I think if I was going to characterize the ACS approach to meeting the new recommendations, it's a multi-pronged approach, right? They got their gold journal. So if you're an author with funding, you can pay a high APC at ACS and go gold. If you're at an institution that has a read and publish with ACS, your authors are fine. If you're an author that has some funding but not enough to pay one of those high APCs, well, here's your route. You can pay an article development charge of $2,500 to have the right that you probably don't even think you gave away to pay them so you can deposit that author accepted manuscript. And to say that this is outrageous is probably an understatement. So if anybody from ACS is here, you have kicked a hornet's nest with this, and it is just something that's completely a slap in the face in so many, many ways. So I think we are still paying a subscription to ACS. So their read and publish model is not sustainable. It's not equitable. So that pathway is closed. We would never contribute to an author paying one of these ADC charges. And I'm not saying that we're the audience for this. I don't know who the audience is to pay for these things. But I think ACS really, if getting to my grades, I'm not going to give them a failing grade, but D- ACS, I feel like you have a lot of work to do. And the nice thing about this OA transition that's going on is, like, I just look out here and I see a whole bunch of publishers who I know, who I did not know 5 years ago, And the nice thing about what we're doing together is there's a lot of room for conversation, there's a lot of room for partnership, and there's a lot of room for us to find a way together to do these things. Preserving revenue is the number one, so you can have $1 million CEO, probably should not be the goal of what we're trying to do. We're here for science, we're here for knowledge, we're here to face the climate crisis and the next coming public health crisis. And I feel like there's a lot of room for us to work together to do those things. So there is a lot that ACS does that is fantastic, and my chemistry faculty would be mad at me if they heard this talk, because they love their society, and I get that. So I'm going to stop there. 3 societies, all nonprofit, taking 3 different approaches to this public access requirement. Thank you.